The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the prison library. Jamila Carter, now 23, sat hunched over a dog-eared legal textbook, her fingers tracing the words self-defense under California's Penal Code 243 PC. She'd been locked away since she was 14, her youth stolen by a system that refused to hear her truth. It was March 14, 2025, and for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something dangerous: hope. Her mother, Marissa Carter, slid a crumpled note across the table during their weekly visitation. It was a printout of a news snippet someone had shared online. A police officer in Jackson was arrested last week for domestic violence after crashing his car into a ditch. His wife finally spoke out. Jamila read it twice, her pulse quickening. "Sounds familiar," Marissa whispered, her voice brittle but proud. "You're not alone in this." Jamila wasn't alone, not in her fight, and not in the statistics she'd uncovered. She'd spent months poring over books and smuggled articles, learning that domestic violence in police families could be 2 to 4 times higher than in the general population. The numbers were murky. Some studies claimed 40% of police families faced it, others said 28% of officers admitted to abuse. But the pattern was clear. It wasn't just her story. It was an epidemic cloaked by badges and silence. Another note from Marissa had quoted a survivor: "When your abuser is a cop, who do you call? They are the law." That line haunted her, a mirror to her own nightmare. The nightmare began on June 5, 2012, in their small Los Angeles apartment. The air was thick with tension, the kind that had built over 2 years of Marissa's excuses and Jamila's pleas. Officer Derek Miles, Marissa's boyfriend, stumbled through the door, his breath sour with whiskey. He was a decorated cop, a man who wore his authority like armor, but tonight that armor was cracking. He'd always been aggressive. Bruises on Marissa's arms were proof, but this time it was worse. Jamila woke to the sound of shattering glass and her mother's muffled cry. She slipped out of bed, heart pounding, and peered into the kitchen. Derek loomed over Marissa, his voice a low growl. "You think you can talk back to me?" he snarled, shoving her against the counter. Jamila froze, memories flashing, nights of shouting, days of hiding marks with long sleeves. She'd begged Marissa to leave him, but her mom always said, "He's not so bad when he's sober." Tonight, he was anything but sober. When Jamila heard a thud, a body hitting the floor, she bolted from her room. Marissa was crumpled against the cabinets, clutching her side, while Derek towered over her, fist raised. Panic seized Jamila. She didn't think, she acted. Grabbing a cast-iron skillet from the table, she swung with all her strength. It connected with a sickening crack against Derek's shoulder. He stumbled, blood trickling from a gash, but the fury in his eyes only grew. "You little," he roared, lunging at her. The police arrived minutes later, lights flashing through the curtains. Jamila and Marissa thought help had come. Instead, they were met with cold stares and handcuffs. Derek was one of them, a brother in blue, and the responding officers didn't ask for their side. They saw his injuries, heard his story. "She attacked me out of nowhere," and that was enough. Jamila, a skinny 14-year-old with trembling hands, was charged as an adult with aggravated assault. Marissa was booked for battery. As they were dragged away, Derek's smug grin burned into Jamila's memory, a promise that he'd won. The courtroom was a blur of polished wood and stern faces. Jamila's public defender, Leonard Hayes, was a harried man with a stack of files and no time. He showed up late to her hearing, fumbling through papers, muttering about budget cuts. "I'm sure it's in here somewhere," he said, as if her life was a misplaced memo. The prosecutor, Nathaniel Brooks, painted her as a menace, holding up a photo of Derek's bruised arm. "She's violent, Your Honor, a threat to society." Jamila tried to speak. "He was hurting my mom," but the gavel silenced her. "Order," the judge barked. Leonard barely glanced up, offering no defense beyond a mumbled, "She's just a kid." The judge, unimpressed by his disarray, sentenced her to 15 years. Marissa got probation, but the guilt of failing her daughter was a heavier shackle. As Jamila was led away in chains, she heard Nathaniel sneer, "Guess we know where she gets her temper." Prison swallowed her whole. Days bled into weeks, then years, marked by gray walls and the clank of metal doors. Marissa visited every week, her eyes hollow but her resolve unbroken. "We'll get you out," she'd say, though neither knew how. Jamila sank into despair, her spirit fraying, until one day Marissa brought a spark. It was a story about Tanya Rivers, a woman who'd been in a similar bind, jailed, broke, and abandoned by counsel. Tanya had represented herself, won her case, and later became a lawyer. If she could do it, Marissa said, pressing the article into Jamila's hands, why not you? Jamila scoffed, her voice rough from disuse. I don't know law, Mom. I barely finished 8th grade before this. But the idea took root, a tiny ember in the dark. She had time, too much of it, and a fire that hadn't died. She started small, borrowing books from the prison library, scribbling notes on yellow legal pads. She learned about the castle doctrine, how it allowed self-defense for herself or others in her home. She read another online post Marissa smuggled in. An Indiana officer was charged with strangulation and battery today. His girlfriend fought back. It wasn't just inspiration, it was proof. She wasn't the only one pushing back. Night after night, she studied, her cell a makeshift classroom. She traced legal terms with a stubby pencil, memorizing statutes, building a case in her mind. The ember grew into a flame. She wasn't just a prisoner anymore. She was a fighter, and this fight was just beginning. The prison library became Jamila Carter's sanctuary, a cramped corner of chipped tables and faded books where she forged her weapon, knowledge. By March 14, 2025, she'd transformed from a scared teenager into a woman with a mission. Her hands, once soft, were calloused from flipping pages, her eyes sharp from reading fine print. She'd learned that self-defense wasn't just a plea, it was a right, etched into California's Penal Code 243 PC. She'd also learned the system didn't care unless you made it listen. Marissa fueled her fire with every visit, slipping her scraps of hope. One was a quote from a survivor. I survived because my fire burned brighter than his fists. Another was a news blurb someone had posted online. A UK officer got 18 months for pushing his print partner downstairs. Jamila clutched it, her jaw tight. The world was full of Derek Mileses, men who hid behind badges, and she was done letting them win. Her first lawyer, Leonard Hayes, had been a disaster. She'd fired him after he botched her appeal hearing, showing up late with the wrong client's file. I'm juggling too many cases, he'd whined as the judge postponed the hearing for 30 days. Good luck, he'd added, already halfway out the door. Jamila didn't need his luck. She'd make her own. She told Marissa, I'm representing myself? You sure? Marissa asked, worry creasing her face. I've got no choice, Jamila said. No one else cares enough. She dove deeper into her studies, piecing together the night of June 5, 2012. She remembered Derek's drunken rage, Marissa's fall, the skillet in her hand. She'd acted to protect, but the police report called her the aggressor. Why? Because Derek was one of them, and the LAPD closed ranks. She found articles hinting at a blue wall of silence, a code that shielded cops like him. Statistics backed it up. Domestic violence rates in police families were debated, but one figure stuck out. 28% of officers admitted to it in old surveys. She wondered how many more stayed silent. Her breakthrough came unexpectedly. Flipping through a roster of officers from that night, she spotted a name, Carla Ortiz. She'd been there, a young cop with a notepad taking statements. Jamila wrote her a letter, pouring out her story, 2 pages of raw truth, mailed to an Atlanta PD address she'd tracked down. Weeks later, a reply came. I've carried this for years. I'm ready to talk. They met in a visitation room, separated by scratched plexiglass. Carla, now older, wore a weary expression but sat tall. I thought you were defending your mom, she said, voice low. I saw her on the floor, Derek over her. But his buddy, another officer, pulled me aside, said he's one of us, she's trouble. I went along with it, wrote you up as the aggressor. It didn't sit right. Jamila leaned forward, heart racing. Why didn't you say anything? I tried, Carla said. Told my captain a year later, after I heard whispers about Derek's other fights. He said I'd tank the department's image, maybe my career. Keep quiet, he told me, or you're done. So I quit instead, moved to Atlanta. But when your letter came, I knew I couldn't stay silent. What else do you know? Jamila pressed. Derek had a pattern, Carla said. Multiple domestic calls over the years. Different women, same story. Each time his crew cleaned it up. They used me as a pawn that night, and I let them. Jamila's hands clenched into fists. Will you testify? Carla nodded. For you, yeah. It's time. The 30-day delay became her proving ground. She spent every waking hour preparing, drafting arguments, cross-referencing Carla's story with scraps of evidence she'd gathered. Incident logs, witness names, anything she could get through prison mail. She practiced in her cell, pacing the 6x8 space, reciting her case to the concrete walls. "Your Honor," she'd say, "this isn't just about me. It's about a system that protects abusers." Marissa brought more fuel, a post she'd heard about scribbled on a napkin. "Florida cop arrested for domestic battery, 3rd time this year." "See?" Marissa said. "They're not untouchable." Jamila nodded, tucking it into her growing file. She wasn't just fighting for freedom, she was fighting for every woman silenced by a badge. The stakes rose as the hearing neared. Word spread through the prison grapevine. Guards whispered, inmates cheered. "You're taking on a cop?" one asked wide-eyed. "They'll bury you." Jamila shrugged. "They've already tried." Derek hadn't vanished either. Marissa warned her he'd been sniffing around, asking about the appeal. "He's nervous," she said. "Good?" Jamila felt a chill. Nervous cops were dangerous cops, but it only sharpened her resolve. She'd face him in court, armed with truth and Carla's testimony. The blue wall was cracking, and she'd hammer it until it fell. On the eve of the hearing, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought of Tanya Rivers, the woman who'd inspired her, jailed, then freed by her own grit. She thought of Marissa, bruised but unbroken. And she thought of the women she'd never met, their stories echoing in posts and quotes. "They say 40% of police families face this. Why's it still hidden?" That one, shared online, lingered in her mind, not because it was new, but because it was a question she'd answer. Tomorrow, she'd step into the ring, not as a victim, but as a warrior. The courtroom smelled of wood polish and tension on the day of Jamila Carter's appeal, March 14, 2025. She stood in a borrowed blazer, her legal pads clutched tight, facing a sea of skeptical faces. Nathaniel Brooks, the prosecutor, smirked from his table, ready to bury her again. Derek Miles sat in the gallery, his glare a silent threat. But Jamila wasn't the scared 14-year-old anymore. She was a force, forged in a decade of fire. "Good morning, Your Honor," Nathaniel began, voice smooth. "The people stand by the original conviction. The defendant attacked Officer Miles with a skillet, unprovoked, violent. She's a menace." "I'll be speaking for myself," Jamila cut in, her tone steady. The judge, a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes, raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Proceed." She took a breath, her voice rising clear. "On June 5, 2012, Derek Miles came home drunk and violent. He'd abused my mom, Marissa, for 2 years. I saw the bruises, heard the fights. That night, he knocked her to the floor. I acted to save her, grabbed a skillet and hit him. It was self-defense, Your Honor, under Penal Code 243 PC and the Castle Doctrine. I wasn't the aggressor, he was." Nathaniel smirked. "The police report says otherwise. Miles was the victim. Look at his injuries." Jamila pressed on, unflinching. "The report's a lie. The LAPD covered for him because he's one of theirs. My mom tried to press charges that night, domestic violence, but they ignored her. Why? Because Derek's a cop, and it wasn't just us. He's done this before, a pattern they buried." Derek leaned forward, his voice cutting through. "She's making this up." "You'll get your turn," the judge snapped. "Go on, Miss Carter." "There's a witness," Jamila said, her pulse steady. "Carla Ortiz, an officer that night. She'll tell you what really happened." Nathaniel objected, his tone sharp. "This is hearsay." "Overruled," the judge said. "Let's hear her." Carla took the stand, hands clasped tight. "I was there," she began, voice firm. "At first I thought Jamila acted in self-defense. I saw Marissa on the floor, Derek over her. But another officer, Derek's friend, pulled me aside, said to call her the aggressor. I went along, but it haunted me. Later, I found out Derek had a history, multiple domestic calls, all swept under the rug. They used me as a pawn." The courtroom buzzed. Jamila handed over a file, records she dug up cross-referenced with Carla's words. "This proves misconduct, Your Honor. The LAPD protected him, not us." Derek exploded, leaping up. "Lies! I'm the victim. You've got no proof." "Sit down," the judge barked, "or I'll have you removed." She turned to Jamila. "Anything else?" "Just this," Jamila said, holding up the survivor quote Marissa had given her. "When your abuser is a cop, who do you call?" She met the judge's gaze. "I called myself." Derek snarled. "You little rat, I'll call my friends." "Enough!" The judge slammed her gavel. "I've seen enough. In light of this evidence, I'm ruling for Miss Carter. She's free to go, and I'm ordering an investigation into the LAPD. Miss Ortiz, thank you for your courage. Case dismissed. Jamila's knees buckled as Marissa rushed to her, tears streaming. You did it, baby! The gallery erupted. Gasps, cheers, Derek's furious muttering as he stormed out. Jamila held her mom tight, the weight of a decade lifting. Days later, she walked out into sunlight, free for the first time in years. Marissa waited, beaming. Someone's here for you, she said. It was Carla, smiling faintly. You're all over the news. Teen exposes cop abuse. You look good out here. You too, Jamila laughed. I owe you. You don't owe me anything, Carla said, then grinned. Well, maybe a job. Hard to find work with my record. Oh, and since you're a hotshot attorney now, can you help expunge it? Jamila chuckled. A job and free legal help? I thought I didn't owe you. Just a little favor, Carla teased. Fine, Jamila said. Let's get to work. She didn't stop with her freedom. She enrolled in law school, driven by voices she'd found, survivors like one who'd written, I survived because my fire burned brighter than his fists. She read posts online. A UK officer got 18 months for pushing his pregnant partner downstairs. Another, Florida cop arrested for domestic battery, third time this year. A third, they say 40% of police families face this. Why is it still hidden? Each story fueled her. The LAPD investigation bore fruit. Derek was indicted, his cronies exposed. Jamila started a clinic, helping women trapped by abusers with badges. One night she sat with Marissa, flipping through a legal journal. You know, Marissa said, you proved it. The only person you needed was you. Jamila smiled. Yeah, but you helped me see it. In that quiet moment with the world stretching wide before her, Jamila Carter knew her fire would never go out. She'd turn shadows into light, and she'd keep burning for every voice still waiting to be heard.